You're listening to the Longer Haul Youth Ministry Podcast with Jody Livingston, episode number 5. 5 golden episodes. Yep, I've been waiting for that.
Welcome to the Longer Haul Youth Ministry Podcast, helping you survive and thrive in youth ministry. And now your host, Jody Livingston.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Longer Haul Youth Ministry Podcast. Thanks for tuning in today, wherever this finds you. If this is your first time listening, thanks for coming. And if you're coming back, well, thanks for coming back. So today is going to be a great episode. We're going to pick up with the second half of the interview with Joy and Anisa. We started in episode 4. And so if you haven't heard episode 4 yet, you're going to want to go back and listen to that. We really tackled some really good stuff there. Joy is a professional counselor. She is the ministry counselor at Snowbird Wilderness Outfitters. So over the course of a year, counsels thousands of teens, works with hundreds and hundreds of churches, youth pastors, and youth workers. And so she's on the forefront for sure of just helping hurting kids and hurting pastors and youth workers. So a lot of wisdom there. We tackled a lot of that in the first episode. We're going to pick up in this one with a question I asked right at the end of the last episode. And so she's going to lay out a few things here in response to that. We also talk about her book in here, which is a great book that everyone should certainly go and pick up and read. There'll be a link for that in the show notes, as well as all the other resources that we talk about and mention in here. You can find those over at thelongerhaul.com/episode 005. thelongerhaul.com/episode 005. As always, if you enjoy the show and the podcast, be sure and add it to your favorite RSS feed or subscribe at iTunes and leave a review there. I'd greatly appreciate that. That helps other folks find the podcast, other youth pastors and youth workers who can be helped and equipped, hopefully, through what we're doing here. You can also follow me over on Twitter at Jody Livingston. That's Jody Livingston. And, of course, The Longer Haul on Facebook. Questions, comments, you can leave on the post there below the show notes. And with that said, we'll jump right into the second half of the interview with Joy and Anisa. If you're going to say to a youth pastor, I know this is I'm about to drop a huge, open another can. We don't have to do that. You don't have to take a lot of time to do this. But if you were just going to say, hey, here's a few things that you would say to a youth pastor. If you got kids struggling in any area or you've got kids who are hurting, here are 3 or 4, 5 tips, things that you've got to do, how to approach that and how to do that.
First and foremost, you're going to have to invest time with that student. And it's with most people, they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. It's that old saying. And that's true regardless of what generation is before you. So a lot of it's invest time and make it fun time. Most people can't handle too lengthy and too often of intense, deep conversation. I mean,
right.
It's just not going to happen. And most teens are ADD, whether they've been, diagnosed or not. They
right.
are. So,
right.
You got to think for every hour you're investing in that student, one-on-one time, probably out of that 60 minutes, you're going to have maybe 15 minutes of really meaningful conversation. Because a lot of times you're going to have to press in hard and back off, because ultimately at the end, what you want them to do is you want them to come around and be their idea.
Right.
Because if they're doing it to please you, then you're going to go away at some point and they're going to keep on doing what they're doing. So time is definitely one. 2 is, I think sometimes the wisest thing we can do in a situation is know that we may not be the best fit for that student. We may have to direct that student to someone else within our church that they know they'll identify with. Could be somebody with a similar issue that they've had victory over. Could be just somebody personality they connect with. I connect more with personality types. It's not so much if we even have a lot in common. I connect with personality types. So sometimes it's personality driven. And a lot of times the best thing to do, if you're not connecting, observe that student. Who are you seeing them drawn to? And they're going to give away who they like the most in your youth group. They're going to give away which youth leader, which volunteer they would rather spend time with. And so a lot of times it's relinquishing your role. And so time, knowing if you're not the right fit, it's okay. It's not anything personal. You're just not the right fit.
It's important also in those situations to, at that point, invest in that other person so that you're not out of the loop of what's happening. You're kind of coaching up, mentoring, that person who's then pouring into that student.
Yeah. I mean, I do this every summer. Sometimes when some of our, I'll have a situation, a summer staff will come to me and say, this is a conversation I had last night with a student. I don't know what to say. Will you talk to them? And I can observe them at lunchtime and I'll know immediately they don't care anything that I have to say because they're always going to see me like their mother, So what I'll do is I will just text conversation starters to that summer staffer and I'll let them run with it. And I may never cross paths with that. I may never verbally talk to that student, but it's at the end of the day, it's who has the most effect. And that's what you want. And then, so time, when, what your role is in that student's life or who is going to have the greatest impact in that student's life. Know that. And then obviously third is, how are you in a general arena communicating in a way that you're needing to speak to maybe 3 kids in your group, but you also know it's something that everybody has to hear so that those 3 don't feel singled out. I mean, you know how it is. You go to church and you walk out and you're like, I think the preacher was talking directly to me.
Yeah, usually he is because I'm sitting on the front row.
And so it's kind of that to really know the dynamic of your youth group, to know when it's time to address something in a general forum, maybe because, okay, I've now had this brought in front of me 5 times in the last 2 weeks. So if 5 kids out of 25 kids are struggling with this, well, there's more. They're just not being vocal about it, or they haven't been caught or whatever. So a lot of it is really understanding the dynamic of the group you work with. And then last but not least, obviously, I would say is, probably more than anybody, and what I see at Snowbird all the time is you're not a one-man band. You depend heavily on those full-time volunteers that want to invest in the youth in your church. And so you have got to invest probably on a monthly basis to some degree into your volunteers as a group away from the youth. That's huge because they're having conversations that you're never going to know about. That's happening. It's happening on Facebook, text messages, whatever. And so make sure they're not getting burned out. Make sure one kid isn't monopolizing their time. That can happen sometimes. And as a volunteer, they may not know how to, set boundaries and things like that. So, I would say, there's so much more. I'm sure that a youth pastor would tell you something differently, but.
Well, no, I think those are the things I would probably say as well. And then along with kind of number 2 and number 4 is like, you got to know when to refer and get folks out. And I've written on the blog before, like, hey, there's probably 4 people every youth pastor should know and have a good relationship with. You got to know the school counselor at the schools you serve. At least they need to know you exist. And if you, and in some cases, like for us, we're ministering to, but there's a ton of high schools and we're in Metro Atlanta. We're pulling from dozens of schools. I can't know all of those. But on a deep level, but I need to know who they are. They need to know me. You need to have somebody on the police force that that you can call if something goes on. Somebody, with social services, I think that you can call, that you have a relationship with, and then a really solid biblical counselor that and have sat down with, talked to, kind of interviewed, if you will, because just because it says Christian doesn't mean it's good, just like churches. And so you want to make sure that you have those relationships. And then obviously you want to try to involve the parents when possible to whatever extent you can. And so you really kind of put a team around those students, and everybody has to be on the same page in that sense, that we're all loving first. It kind of come full circle, I guess, on that. So, I'll put a link to that post, I think, in the show notes. But that's just, I see a lot of youth pastors who don't have those relationships with people in their community, and you got to have them, because something's going to happen where you're going to need to call somebody, and it's too late at that point to try to figure out who to call. You got to know early on. If you're new at a church, one of the first things you ought to do is find those people and sit down with them. I would do that week one if it were me, because you have no idea what's waiting for you anyway. So be prepared.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the book a little bit. And
sure.
I know we've kind of gone a little bit long here, but that's okay. This is good stuff. Tell a little bit. The book's Identity Crisis, right? And it's great. It's great. That was a long process. I know we talked some during that. And there's a lot that goes into writing a book, clearly. So tell me a little bit about the book. Those listening, what made you say, "Hey, I'm going to write a book"?
Well, I think deep down, that's always been a goal or dream or whatever you want to call it. I like to write to a fault. Like, I was the nerd that loved the term papers. I got excited. That was me. So I love to write. It's just a great outlet for me. It's very relaxing. I don't see it as a chore. I did not pass that on to my children, so it's disappointing. However, it is something I do love to do. But honestly, identity crisis, moving from crisis to credibility, that came about really obviously out of my own story. Now, my publisher, my editor, everyone, we realized from the very beginning that it wasn't actually going to be my story. I needed to write it in such a way that anyone could pick it up and find themselves in this book. Because the bottom line is, none of us are exempt from a crisis. If it hasn't happened yet, it's going to happen. It may not be what my crisis was, and I hope it won't be, but you never know. But ultimately, my crisis was divorce, and it rocked my world, I would say. I grew up, like I said, in a Christian home, Christian school, went to Liberty University. I never in a million years thought I would be that girl, at all. But after 14 years, the marriage ended at his will, not mine. And I was served papers, and I fought. I can say this. I do have a clear conscience in the area that I fought hard for my marriage. But in that, the Lord showed me, even so, when we were talking about his character earlier, in your darkest days, you see the character of God I don't know that you can see anywhere else.
Yeah.
See it in the dark. And the one thing that the Lord showed me through all of that, we love to say God is good. How often do you say, God answered my prayer, God is good? Or God came through, God is good. Here's the question. What if God doesn't come through?
Yeah. What if the answer is no? I've written on that. What if the answer is no?
He's still good.
Yeah.
He's still good. And for whatever reason, the Lord did not perform the miracle that I preferred. He did not save my marriage. He did not, in the end, it crumbled. Yeah. But the thing that the Lord challenged me in that and grew me and really dug deep into my life was, it doesn't matter the circumstances. He is still good. He is still faithful. He is still loving. He is still in control. He is still sovereign in all of those things. And there was a sermon that Johnny Hunt, the pastor of First Baptist Woodstock, he preached back in 2011 called God is in Your Storm. I listened to it so much, Jody, I had it memorized word for word. I mean, I didn't even have to listen to the sermon. I just could repeat the sermon.
Yeah.
And it's a powerful sermon, but he says something in this sermon, and it actually became an entire chapter in the book. And Pastor Hunt was very gracious, and he endorsed the book. And but he made a quote, and I think this sums up. This will give a great picture of the book overall in this quote. And it says, "Sometimes God chooses to dig the well of joy with the spade of sorrow."
Yeah, that's good.
And when he said that in that sermon, I would repeat myself to, because all I had was sorrow. All I had, I felt like everything was being taken, stolen, stripped away from me. I had no control. And in the midst of this, remember, I was the marriage and family counselor at a very large church in Middle Georgia.
Right.
Your marriage and family counselor is not supposed to go through a divorce. It's not supposed to happen. And so I think it brought things to light within our staff that we never really talked about. We really began to have those real life conversations because someone in their midst was going through such a dark trial. But I have to say, the book is not just gloom, despair, and agony on me. It is hope in the midst of what seems hopeless, because life shatters. You live long enough, something is going to happen that you have absolutely no control over, that will fly in the face of everything you stand for, everything you believe in, and it will rock you to your core. And it may not happen to you personally. You may watch it happen to one of your children. It may be your grandchild. It may be your parent, your sibling, someone on your spouse. Something will happen in your life, because I think we have the book of Job. I mean, we have so many stories of people's lives, real people, ordinary people in Scripture, and it happened. I can't think of one person that didn't happen to.
Yeah.
I can't think of one.
And I think even going back to what we were talking about earlier with students who are in struggles, I mean, that's the lesson learned here, is that you really learn the character and nature of God in difficulty. You learn the goodness of God in those moments. And when we teach our kids unintentionally that if you come to Jesus, it'll be all right. There's truth in that. Don't get me wrong, there's truth in that, but it's not the all right that we think of, and it's not the all right that they're thinking. And so I think to be able to steer and walk through and just encourage in those, and just to see the love of God when things aren't good, right? And that's, I made this statement last Wednesday. We were teaching, I said, if your worship to God, if your worship of God is only feels powerful, or the experience only feels good when life is good, it's probably not really worship of God. It's more worship of circumstance. And so our worship of God should never change, because we worship Him for who He is, not what He does. What He does, the blessings He gives, the faithfulness of the Lord, those drive us to the character of who He is. And it should deepen our worship, but it should not, define our worship. And I look back over the past,
since about 2008 to now, and I mean, it makes my head spin. I would have never in a million years, thought that I would be a part of a ministry such as Snowbird, and the Lord to open the doors He has for me to speak. I speak at women's conferences and things like that, and to open up doors for that. Because honestly, my worst fear is, I know, because now I've lived it, but there's a reason that God says in Scripture He hates divorce. I mean, there's a reason. However, I think Satan uses an event such as divorce to somehow convince the believer they're labeled and now they're useless.
Yeah.
And the one thing the Lord comforted me in, because I did feel useless. I knew at some point I had to walk away from being the marriage and family counselor, at a ministry that I love dearly. Didn't know what that was going to look like at the time. And, I had no connection with Snowbird, prior to the director calling me and offering me the job because they had a position that was needed for that. I think I had spoke to Brody a total of 30 minutes. I couldn't tell you one thing about him, and he couldn't tell you anything about me. So it wasn't like I had this relationship with Snowbird and they found out what had happened. They felt sorry for me and called me. It wasn't like that at all. But the Lord, I based the book Identity Crisis came out of my own study. I studied for 2 years. I just stayed in the book of Nehemiah. It's like the Lord just parked me there. And we like to use Nehemiah anytime we have a building project going on at our church.
Right.
After studying Nehemiah, just so you know, it has nothing to do with a building project at your church. And the Lord taught me so much talk about his character, but he taught me about a process, that there's a process to our restoration. And Jerusalem wasn't rebuilt overnight. It took a lot of, blood, sweat, and tears for the people that took on that task. And, but what I learned in that is before I could even entrust myself to the Lord and entrust myself to his process for the restoration, and that's key. It's his process, not my process of the restoration, was I had to really know what was damaged. I had to know what was damaged within me. But I couldn't get past I'm useless because I'm divorced. No, I'm never going to speak again in a women's conference. I'm never going to, I just felt like churches would say, I'm sorry, we can't use you, And so I'd go through this. I'd be invited to speak at women's conferences, and immediately I would, say, you do understand I'm divorced. I felt like I had to say it, like,
Right.
kind of thing. And the one thing that the Lord showed me is we think labels are bad. And I don't think labels are bad. I'm okay with saying I'm divorced, not in I'm okay with it. You know what I'm saying? There's pain and I'll be healing for years to come. But what I mean by that is Rahab's label was never removed. She's always Rahab the harlot.
Right.
And when the Lord, I think he just has a great sense of humor sometimes. And when I saw that and it just came to life, I thought, you know why? Because every time we see her label, we're reminded of her story, of how she was redeemed and rescued and restored.
Yeah.
And so what if we began to look at our labels to point us back and to point everybody back to our story of redemption, restoration, and rescue, and start trying to get away from our label, So if you're, let's say you're Katie, and you feel like your label is always going to be, the one with the eating disorder, Katie, the eating disorder. What if it's then we go into youth ministry? What if we stop telling Katie you need to stop thinking of yourself that way? Maybe she's never supposed to stop. Maybe that's God's way of always putting his grace in front of her every day.
Yeah.
And that he's redeemed her, restored her, whatever, if it's, whatever it is. And so I think so often we want restoration to automatically remove the label. And my label's never going to be removed. It never is. And so through that, the Lord just, as I was, so much of this book comes right out of my journal. So some parts were easy to write because it was right there. But I think that the publisher and the editor, they did a really good job of directing me so that anyone can pick up this book and read it. And it's not a how-to book. If you do these 10 steps, life will be perfect. What it is it really is, if you wanted to put it as a how-to book, I would have to say this. It's a how to live with joy in the midst of your circumstances. That's what it is.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would agree with that. So, I've been asking everybody for a resource at the end that they would recommend to folks other than your book. Where can folks find the book?
It's on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles. It's available for Kindle. It's Nook. I think Walmart now has it. Target has it. It's now also on iBooks with Apple. Also,
Cool.
It's in a variety of places, but Amazon obviously is usually people's go-to. So,
yeah. And if people want to find you, where can they find you?
joyanisa.com. And there's a link there to my blog also.
Okay. So we'll put all that in the show notes for you. And then a resource, would it be, I know you mentioned Faithful
Definitely,
and True
yes.
Ministries earlier.
Definitely. Faithful and True Ministries, Dr. Mark Laser, and his name's spelled different. It's Laaser. Dr. Mark Laser. I really encourage pastors, youth pastors, parents. He has books, workbooks, podcasts, blogs, you name it. And his wife, Deborah. They're great.
That's awesome. Well, great. Well, Joy, thank you so much. Man, I encourage everybody to go get the book. It is phenomenal. It really is a good, just a good resource. Even if you're not in a difficult circumstance, you're going to know people are. And again, at some point you will enter into that. So just a great, great, great book. Thank you so much, Joy. I appreciate it very much.
You're welcome.
And all right. Thanks. Well, there you have it. The rest of the interview with Joy and Anisa. Just a great interview overall. It was so good. The whole conversation I enjoyed so much. Lot of stuff there. A lot of information in both episodes, both 4 and in this one, that you can use and take. Hopefully that you will find helpful in that. All of the links that we mentioned will be in the show notes. Again, I would highly encourage you to go pick up Joy's book, From Crisis to Credibility. Such a good read. Just an incredible lady with just an incredible testimony. Loves Jesus with everything she has in her, and loves people and serves and steers and just counsels so many. She's a great resource for youth pastors and youth workers. I hope you really enjoyed the episode and the interview and found something helpful there. Again, if you're enjoying the podcast, head over to iTunes and subscribe there, or on Stitcher. Leave a positive review there. That really helps other folks find it. And be sure to check out the show notes over at thelongerhaul.com/episode 005. thelongerhaul.com/episode 005. And that'll do it for us here today in this episode. Thanks again for tuning in. And until next time, give 'em Jesus.
Thanks for listening to the Longer Haul Youth Ministry Podcast at www.thelongerhaul.com.